Happy Saturday, scientists! We're starting a revision video series by discussing revision techniques. No matter what subject you're studying, the way you revise will have a huge impact on how well you do, regardless of how good you are at that subject. Let's begin. No one revision technique works for everyone all of the time. Think of them as a set of tools that you have at your disposal. Pick the right one for the job and know how to use it. Before we discuss the research and the revision techniques, you knew there was going to be research in this video, I'm a science nerd after all, we need to talk about how to take notes properly. The key to being able to revise well is to start with good material. Depending on your school, you might have access to a digital textbook, a paper textbook, revision guides, any of those things, but you will definitely have access to your own notes, and the quality of those notes is entirely up to you. There are many different ways of taking notes, and I'll discuss and show you two different ones in this video. I'd like you to pick one to try out in lessons, but give it a while as you are learning a new skill and that takes time. At the end of this video, I'll show you what each example would have looked like if I'd used it to take notes for this video. That way you'll get a better idea of how they can be used. The first technique is called the Cornell method, and it was developed in the 1940s by William Locke at Cornell University in the United States. I've used this technique myself throughout my studies, and I found it to work really, really well. Begin with a clear date and title. When you're revising later, you'll want to be able to go back to the correct topic and put your notes in the correct order. And without clear dates and titles, this can become a nightmare. Next, we're going to divide the page into 3 sections. On the left, running most of the way down the page, you're going to have a 6 centimeter wide section. This is going to be for your cues or your key ideas during the lesson. On the right, taking up most of the page, is your notes for the lesson. And finally, at the bottom, about 6 centimeters from the bottom of the page, you are going to have your summary section. For those of you who take notes digitally, we've included a Google Docs template that you can use in the video description. Now that we're all set up, here's how we're going to go about using these notes. Everyone does this slightly differently, and you will probably change over time as you get more used to this technique and to taking notes in general. During the lesson, or when you're reading a textbook or watching a video, you're going to fill out the notes section. And do not, I repeat, do not write down every single word or bit of information. It may seem like this is a good idea, but it actually hurts your ability to remember. You can easily fall behind, and your brain isn't doing any work with the information. Several studies show the importance of complete notes and notes taken in your own words. We know that when you have to think about the information, in order to put the information in your own words or into shorthand, you remember more about that information later on. You should use symbols, shorthand, abbreviation, and diagrams to help you record key ideas quickly. Here are some examples of commonly used shorthands. If your teacher specifically mentions a keyword, an example, or an equation, then you should indicate that in your notes, as it might come back as a test question. As you take your notes, or as soon as possible after class, you should fill out the questions or cues section. This is where you should put keywords, equations, and questions that you think could come up on the exam. When you study, you'll use these as prompts to remember the information in the notes section. The summary section should be filled out later that day or that week. Reread the notes and write down what key points and ideas were. What was discussed in that section of the lesson? What other topics does it relate to in this course, in other courses? Your brain likes connections between topics, and that will help you remember the information. The second note-taking technique I like to call the bubble method. The layout of this one is a bit more free-flowing. Start with your page in landscape and put the date at the top somewhere. In the center, write down the title. As you listen, read, or watch, take notes that branch out from the topic title. If there are relationships between the topics, include these with lines between the different topics or section. It is a good idea to write in a key word or two about the relationship. The same points apply for the notes that you take. Don't write down every word, put the ideas into your own words, and summarize the key points. Now that you've made yourself some excellent study notes, it's time to talk about how to revise using those notes and the other techniques that are available to you. There's a lot of research around how students study and what works best. In nearly all those studies, the biggest predictor of success has nothing to do with the student's ability and everything to do with how much consistency and effort they put into their studies. For example, a study in 2014 by Courtney West and her colleagues found that a student's ability to plan and stick to a revision schedule and how they used and completed practice questions were the two factors that predicted their success in exams. How and where you study and what you do around your studies is also important. An interesting study in 2015 by Kirsten Corder and colleagues looked at physical activity and screen time. They found that for some students, an increase in physical activity of about an hour a day during their studies actually helped them with their exams, but those results weren't conclusive and didn't apply to every student. What was conclusive, however, were their results on screen time. In my quoting voice, an extra hour of screen time was associated with fewer points, whereas an extra hour of non-screen time, reading and homework, was associated with more points. In some cases, this was actually equivalent to 1 or 2 GCSE grades, so it really is quite important. So when you're studying, put your phone away and create a focused space both around you and within your mind. Setting yourself up a space to study is very important. This can be in your room, in the local library, in the kitchen in your house, at school, wherever works for you. The space isn't as important as what you put in it and the fact that it's protected. And by that I mean that you're not going to be interrupted. You're free from distractions. So the next thing, now that you've got your space, is to talk about the time that you should put into this. Contrary to popular belief, a marathon study session isn't a good idea. Studies have found that short, sharp bursts of about 20 to 30 minutes and a clear, focused time in that 20 to 30 minutes give far better results than students who try and cram the night before an exam. So you've got your time set out, you've got your space set out. What should you do in your study session? Well, you need to read through your notes and memorize them? No. We've already talked about how your brain needs to be active when you're taking the notes, and the same applies when you're studying. You need to read through the material, you need to understand the material, and you need to think about what it actually means. Something that worked well for me was to create cue or index cards. It's especially useful in subjects like biology, where you have a lot of key ideas or key terms to learn. On one side of the card you put the word or the key idea or the equation that you're trying to learn, and on the other you put some information about it. So that might be the units for a physics equation or the definition for a keyword. Do that for all the keywords or ideas or equations in a topic, and then when it comes to studying, you look at one side of the card and you try and remember the information that's on the other. You should do this both ways, so look at the definition and try and remember the word, for example, but then also look at the word and try and remember the definition. And this will help your brain to form those connections that you need in order to remember the information. Use these cards in short, sharp sessions, on the bus or on the way to or from school. For example, maybe get a friend or family member to quiz you on what's on your cards. You can use the cues or hints column in your Cornell style notes for the same thing. Cover the main notes section and then try and remember the information using those cues as hints to help you. Another technique is similar to the bubble notes method, but instead of just being for one lesson, you might summarize several lessons into one web. Think about the links that exist between the different topics and ideas, and it's especially good for learning something like the methods in required practicals, where you need to know the links between the steps and why they happen in that order. I often make my students do flowcharts, which is kind of a variation on this, for all the steps in their required practicals. They often hate it at the time, but they've done better on their exams, so I'll live with their hatred while they're studying. The attitude that you go into your study sessions with is also very important. In a 2014 study, it was found that students who learned something expecting to teach it to someone else did far better than students who learned it expecting to take a test on it. So as you're going through your notes, think about maybe as if you were going to try and teach that to someone else. In fact, maybe you do that. Gather together with a group of your friends, pick a topic each, and then teach those topics to each other. This will be good because not only are you forcing yourself to learn the topic as if you're going to teach it, which will increase your understanding of that topic, but you'll also be hearing topics taught to you in a different way than your teachers might have used in lesson, and that can help you find new connections and reinforce things in your brain that you didn't think about before. The last thing we need to talk about is practice and exam-style questions. These are very important. They're not only an opportunity for you to go and see how the questions are going to be structured on the exam, but they're also very useful because you can go and look at the mark schemes and you can see what the examiners are going to be looking at in your answer. And you can start changing your answers around a little bit so they kind of match more to that method and that format that the examiner is going to be looking for. You should also think about the command words. Are there some that you find very challenging to answer? Are you always missing out bits of information? Think about really understanding and reading the whole question. We'll talk more about these in terms of analyzing those questions when we talk about exam technique. At the beginning of the video, we talked about 2 different note-taking techniques. I'd like to show you now what each of these would have looked like if I'd used them to take the notes on the video. So as I watched back the video, you can see that I've taken some notes. I've tried to put things into my own words and to write down just the bits of information that I'm going to need in order to remember these later. You'll see that at certain points I've inserted things that I've highlighted. These are references to external things. It's a good idea to reference those and to highlight them or show them in some way so that you know that those are things you can go and look at later. For example, you might be interested in reading those full studies. There's also sections like, for example, the symbols and point form that maybe I don't need to copy all the way down in my notes if I have access to that video and that title screen and I can go back and see them later. You can see that at the end I've written a summary, and the summary is in my own words. So I've taken kind of all the ideas on the page, not necessarily in the same order that they were there, and I've put them into my own words. And this is something that normally you would do kind of in the next week or later on when you're studying. On the left-hand side, you can see that I've gone in and just put the kind of key points and key ideas of each section in next to that section. So if I were studying this, I would cover up my notes section, and I'd use those key ideas or points to link into what am I supposed to remember from this section. Let's take a look at the bubble notes method now. You can see that this one looks a little bit different, and for some people you might find this a little bit more messy. Sometimes this works great as a summary, so you might take your ordinary class notes in Cornell style and then later on when you're studying put them into bubble style as a summary. You can see that what I've tried to do is show the relationships between the different ideas and to showcase the key points or ideas of each section. They kind of don't necessarily have a particular flow or order, but that's fine because when you're studying them, you don't necessarily want to study them in a particular flow or order either. These have just been a few ideas of revision techniques and note techniques and things that you can use, and I hope they've been helpful to you. Remember that you should try them out for a while before deciding whether or not it works for you. This is developing a new skill, and that takes time. So if it doesn't work right away, that's fine. Keep at it. Something will work eventually. And if you keep yourself in these short, focused revision sessions with clear notes that are in your own words, you are going to see an improvement in your grades. If you have techniques that are different to these, or ones that work for you or don't work for you, please comment below. We can all learn from each other. Until next week then, happy sciencing.